The morning of August 6, 1945, began like so many others in the final months of the war. In Tokyo, the communications room of the Imperial Japanese Army General Staff hummed with the usual rhythm of wartime operations. Officers moved between desks, sorting through intelligence reports, casualty figures, and damage assessments from the previous night's bombing raids. American B-29s had been striking Japanese cities for months now, leaving blackened ruins where neighborhoods once stood. Then, sometime in the early afternoon, a transmission arrived that made no sense. The message came through military channels from the Chugoku Regional Army Headquarters. It was brief, fragmentary, and impossible. Hiroshima, a city of nearly 350,000 people and a major military hub, had been destroyed. Not damaged, not heavily bombed, destroyed completely by a single aircraft. The officers who first read the message must have checked it twice, 3 times. In the logic of warfare as they understood it, this was impossible. Cities fell after sustained campaigns. Tokyo itself had burned for hours under waves of incendiary bombs that previous March, with hundreds of aircraft dropping thousands of tons of ordnance. Even then, the city had not been completely destroyed. Neighborhoods survived. People emerged from shelters. Life, however scarred, continued. But this message spoke of something else entirely. The initial reaction in the General Staff headquarters was predictable. This had to be an exaggeration. Perhaps a large formation of B-29s had slipped through undetected. Perhaps the Americans had developed a new type of incendiary weapon, something that burned hotter or spread faster. The military mind seeks familiar explanations, patterns drawn from experience, and nothing in anyone's experience prepared them for what had actually occurred. Orders went out immediately. Reconnaissance aircraft were to be dispatched to Hiroshima at first light. Visual confirmation was essential. Radio communications with the city had gone silent, which was concerning but not unprecedented during heavy raids. The truth would be known soon enough. That night, in the war rooms and officers' quarters, scattered throughout what remained of Tokyo, men spoke in low voices. Some recalled rumors they had heard, whispers about new weapons, about scientific research into fundamental forces of nature. But these were the stuff of speculation, the kind of talk that emerged in the later stages of any long war. One officer, trying to make sense of the report, said what many were thinking: one bomb cannot destroy an entire city, not unless it's something beyond our comprehension entirely. Morning came. The reconnaissance aircraft took off, flying west toward Hiroshima. What the pilots saw as they approached the city on August 7th would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Where Hiroshima should have been, where a city of hundreds of thousands had stood just 24 hours earlier, there was nothing. The pilots radioed back, their voices strained, struggling to describe what defied description. The city no longer exists, one reported. Everything is gone. From their altitude, they could see the shape of devastation, a massive area of complete destruction, radiating outward from a central point. The rivers that cut through Hiroshima were visible, and the bay beyond, but the city itself had been erased. Buildings that had stood for decades, even centuries, had been reduced to shadows and ash. The characteristic pattern of an ordinary bombing raid, with some structures damaged, others untouched, neighborhoods destroyed while others survived, was absent. This was total. This was absolute. The photographs brought back by the reconnaissance missions removed any remaining doubt. In the offices of the War Ministry's Technical Bureau, scientists and engineers examined the images with growing horror. They knew immediately that this was not a conventional weapon. The blast pattern, the scale of destruction, the thermal effects visible even in black and white photographs all pointed to something that should have been theoretical, something that belonged to the realm of physics laboratories and academic papers, not to the arsenal of any military force. The words began to circulate: atomic fission, nuclear reaction, uranium. Panic is perhaps too strong a word for what followed, but uncertainty gripped the highest levels of Japanese military command. Some officers, particularly among the younger and more scientifically literate staff, understood immediately what had happened. The Americans had succeeded in weaponizing atomic energy. Others, including many senior commanders who had built their careers in a different era of warfare, refused to believe it. This had to be propaganda, they insisted, an elaborate American psychological operation designed to break Japanese morale. The enemy was attempting to make one bombing raid, however destructive, seem like the harbinger of unlimited destructive power. The Supreme War Council convened in emergency session. These 6 men, the political and military leaders who directed Japan's war effort, gathered under the portrait of Emperor Hirohito. The weight of their deliberations was absolute. Japan's future, the fate of millions, rested on the decisions made in that room. The divisions within the council were stark. The army, which had dominated Japanese politics for the better part of 2 decades, argued that the war must continue. General Korachika Anami, the Minister of War, was perhaps the most vocal proponent of continued resistance. In his view, even the loss of 1 or 2 cities did not fundamentally alter Japan's strategic position. The homeland could still be defended. The Americans would still have to invade, and when they did, they would face the full fury of a nation fighting for survival. Even if 1 or 2 cities fall, Anami argued, the spirit of Japan will endure. Our people will fight to the last. The Americans will pay such a price for invasion that they will be forced to negotiate. This was not mere rhetoric. It reflected a genuine belief held by many in the Army's high command that spiritual strength could overcome material disadvantage. This idea had been cultivated for years, embedded in military training and national propaganda. Japanese soldiers had demonstrated extraordinary courage and tenacity throughout the war. The belief that this spirit, this willingness to sacrifice everything for the nation and the emperor, would ultimately prove decisive had sustained the leadership even as Japan's strategic position deteriorated. But others in the room understood that the calculus had changed. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Chief of the Naval General Staff, represented a different perspective. The Navy had borne the brunt of the war against American industrial might. Its officers had watched the Pacific Fleet, once the pride of the nation, get systematically destroyed. They had seen American production capacity firsthand, had tracked the seemingly endless stream of new ships, aircraft, and weapons flowing from American factories. And now this. Spirit cannot stop uranium, Toyoda said, his voice carrying the weight of bitter experience. The debate continued, circular and increasingly desperate. But even as the Supreme War Council argued, events were overtaking them. On the morning of August 9th, 3 days after Hiroshima, news reached Tokyo that seemed to confirm the worst fears of those who counseled surrender. The Soviet Union, which had maintained an uneasy neutrality with Japan throughout the European War, had declared war. Red Army forces were pouring across the Manchurian border. The Kwantung Army, once the elite of Japanese military power, was being overwhelmed. Intelligence reports spoke of Soviet tank columns advancing at speeds that seemed impossible, of defensive lines collapsing, of Japanese forces being encircled and destroyed. And then, that same day, the second message arrived. Nagasaki had been hit. Another city, another atomic bomb. the American broadcast accompanying the attack was clear. Japan faced a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. The message was unmistakable. This was not a one-time demonstration. The Americans possess multiple atomic weapons and the will to use them. In the intelligence offices of the Imperial Japanese military, staff officers compiled the incoming reports with shaking hands. The situation was beyond critical. One officer's report captured the moment with stark clarity. The Red Army has entered from the north. The Americans strike from the sky with weapons we cannot defend against. We face annihilation from both sides. The illusion of defending the homeland, of forcing the Americans into a costly invasion that would lead to negotiations, collapsed in those hours. The Americans would not invade. They did not need to. They could simply destroy Japan's cities one by one. From an altitude no defense could reach, with weapons no shelter could protect against. And now, with the Soviets entering the war, Japan faced a two-front assault that no amount of courage or determination could withstand. It was in this context that the Imperial Navy's Intelligence Division presented data that in retrospect they should have shared earlier. Perhaps they had shared it and it had been ignored. Perhaps its implications had not been fully understood until this moment of crisis made everything clear. The documents came from various sources: captured Allied materials, diplomatic intelligence, analysis of observed American deployments. They painted a picture that was staggering in its implications. The United States Navy, by the summer of 1945, operated more than 100 aircraft carriers. Not the massive fleet carriers that the Japanese Navy had painstakingly built, each representing years of effort and enormous expense, but a vast armada of vessels ranging from light carriers to massive Essex-class ships. American shipyards had produced these vessels at a rate that seemed to mock the very concept of industrial limitation. Some of the escort carriers, the smaller vessels used for anti-submarine warfare and amphibious support, had been completed in a matter of months from keel laying to commissioning. The aircraft production figures were even more astounding. American factories, working in shifts around the clock, had produced more than 300,000 aircraft during the war years. At peak production, a new bomber rolled off the assembly lines every 5 minutes. Every 5 minutes. The mind struggled to process the implications. In the time it took to conduct a briefing, to eat a meal, to write a report, another bomber was completed, ready to carry bombs to Japanese cities. Ship construction followed similar patterns. Liberty ships, the workhorses of the American merchant fleet, were being produced at a rate of 1 every 3 days. The entire industrial capacity of Japan, working at full mobilization, could not approach even a fraction of this output. And then there was the Manhattan Project itself. The intelligence report included estimates of its cost derived from American congressional documents and budget debates. $2 billion. To put this in perspective, Japan's entire national budget for 1944, the year when the nation was straining every resource for the war effort, totaled less than this single American project. The United States had spent more money developing one weapon than Japan had spent on its entire war effort for an entire year. Admiral Toyoda, reviewing these figures in the days after Nagasaki, reportedly made a statement that captured the fundamental miscalculation that had led Japan into this catastrophe. We have been fighting a nation we never truly understood. This was the heart of it. Japan's leadership had known abstractly that the United States possessed greater industrial capacity. This was obvious, undeniable. But there is a difference between knowing something intellectually and understanding its implications. Japan's leaders had believed that American industrial advantage could be overcome by superior fighting spirit, by better training, by willingness to sacrifice. They had believed that the Americans, soft from prosperity, would lack the will to endure a prolonged conflict. They had believed that a series of sharp defeats would cause the American public to demand peace. Every one of these assumptions had proven catastrophically wrong. And now, with atomic fire falling from the sky and Soviet armies crushing Japanese forces in Manchuria, the price of these miscalculations was coming due. On the night of August 9th, stretching into the early morning hours of August 10th, Emperor Hirohito called a meeting. This was extraordinary in itself. The emperor's role in Japanese governance was complex, more symbolic than executive. But in moments of supreme crisis, his voice carried weight that transcended normal political processes. He summoned the Supreme War Council and key cabinet members to the Imperial Palace. The meeting took place in an underground bunker, protection against the American bombing raids that continued to strike Tokyo. In that concrete room, beneath the palace that symbolized centuries of Japanese sovereignty, the emperor posed a question to each of his military commanders. Given everything they now knew, given the atomic bombs and the Soviet invasion and the overwhelming evidence of American material superiority, was victory still possible? Could Japan still achieve its war aims? Could they even defend the homeland effectively? The silence that followed must have been profound. These were men who had dedicated their lives to military service, who had risen through the ranks of the imperial forces, who had staked their honor and their nation's future on their strategic judgment. To admit defeat, to acknowledge that their sacrifices and the sacrifices of millions of Japanese soldiers and civilians had been in vain, was almost unthinkable. General Anami, the war minister who had argued so passionately for continued resistance, was asked directly, could the army defend Japan? Could they repel an invasion, or at least make it so costly that negotiations would become possible? Anami bowed deeply. The gesture spoke volumes. When he finally responded, his words carried the weight of a man acknowledging a terrible truth. Your Majesty, our strength is exhausted. It was, in that moment, over. Not the war itself, which would require several more days of tense negotiations and political maneuvering to formally end, but the debate about whether to continue fighting. The emperor, hearing from his military commanders that victory was impossible, that even effective defense was beyond their capacity, made his decision. We must endure the unendurable, Hirohito said. The phrase would become famous, repeated in histories and memoirs. But in that moment, in that bunker, it was simply a statement of necessity. Japan would surrender. The alternative, continuing to fight with atomic bombs destroying cities and Soviet armies advancing from the north, was not survival, but annihilation. The days that followed were tense. Elements within the military, particularly among younger officers who could not accept defeat, plotted to prevent the surrender. They planned to seize the recordings of the emperor's surrender message, to continue the war regardless of the government's decision. The plot failed, but it demonstrated how difficult this moment was for Japan's military establishment. For General Anami, the decision to surrender represented a personal crisis that could only be resolved in one way. On the morning of August 15th, as the nation prepared to hear the emperor's voice for the first time, Anami was in his quarters. He had written a final statement, words that attempted to capture his feelings about Japan's defeat and his own responsibility for it. I, with my death, apologize to the emperor for the great crime. The crime he referred to was not any specific military failure, but the larger catastrophe. He had served the emperor, served Japan, and in doing so had helped lead the nation to this point. whether this judgment was fair or not, whether any individual could be held responsible for the complex series of decisions and circumstances that led to this moment, is a question historians still debate. But Anami did not wait for history's judgment. He performed seppuku at dawn, still wearing his uniform, the ritual suicide of samurai tradition, a practice that seemed to belong to a different age, yet persisted into the modern world. His death symbolized, in a way that words could not, the end of an era. The Japan that had embarked on imperial expansion, that had believed in the superiority of spirit over material, that had thought it could challenge the industrial might of America, died with him. At noon on August 15th, 1945, radios across Japan crackled to life. The population had been told that an important announcement would be broadcast, that they should gather to listen. In homes, in factories, in the fields, people clustered around radio sets. Many had never heard the emperor's voice. It was simply not done. The emperor was a figure of such exalted status that his words were mediated through others, his will interpreted by officials and military leaders. But now, in Japan's darkest hour, Hirohito spoke directly to his people. The recording was difficult to hear, not just because of the static and the poor quality of many radios, but because the emperor spoke in a formal, courtly Japanese that most ordinary people struggled to follow. But the message came through. He spoke of the war, of Japan's efforts to secure peace and prosperity in Asia. He spoke of the enemy's use of a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable. And he spoke of the necessity of ending the war, of accepting the terms of the Potsdam Declaration, of enduring what seemed unendurable in order to preserve the nation and its people. In the war rooms and military headquarters across what remained of the Japanese Empire, officers listened in silence. Many wept. These were men who had fought for years, who had sent thousands of subordinates to their deaths, who had believed utterly in the rightness of their cause. To hear the emperor announce defeat was to have the foundation of their world crack and crumble. The empire built on the idea that spiritual strength could overcome material disadvantage, that Japanese will and courage were superior to American industry and wealth, was gone. The bombs that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki had destroyed more than cities. They had destroyed a worldview, a national mythology, a set of assumptions about how power and conflict operated in the modern world. In the weeks and months that followed, as American occupation forces arrived and Japanese military personnel were interrogated, certain phrases appeared again and again in the transcripts. We never believed America could produce so much. We underestimated their science and overestimated our courage. The intelligence was there, but we could not accept it. This last point is particularly significant. It was not that Japan lacked information about American industrial capacity. Intelligence agencies had compiled reports. Diplomatic sources had provided data. Even open source materials, American newspapers and magazines contained information about production figures and industrial expansion. The information was available, but it was not believed. Or rather, its implications were not fully accepted. Historians studying the decision-making processes that led Japan into war with the United States have noted this pattern repeatedly. When intelligence contradicted desired outcomes, when data suggested that strategic plans were flawed, there was a tendency to discount the information, to find reasons why it must be wrong or exaggerated or not as significant as it appeared. This is not unique to Japan. It is a pattern that appears throughout military history in the decision-making of many nations. But in Japan's case, the consequences were particularly catastrophic. The nation's leaders had intelligence suggesting that war with the United States would be extremely difficult, perhaps impossible to win. They had data on American industrial capacity. They knew, or should have known, that the military imbalance would only grow worse over time. But they also had faith in Japanese spirit, in the righteousness of their cause, in the idea that history favored the brave and the determined. And when faith contradicts data, when belief clashes with evidence, the human tendency is to privilege faith. We see what we want to see. We believe what we need to believe. And we discount information that challenges our fundamental assumptions about the world. For Japan's military leaders, the fundamental assumption was that modern war still operated according to principles they understood. That battles were won by superior tactics, better training, greater willingness to sacrifice. These were the principles they had been taught, the lessons they had absorbed through decades of military service, the idea that war had changed, that industrial capacity and scientific advancement had become decisive factors that could override courage and determination, was difficult to accept. The atomic bombs forced that acceptance. They demonstrated in the most brutal way possible that the old rules no longer applied. A single aircraft carrying a single bomb could destroy an entire city. No amount of courage could defend against it. No degree of training could overcome it. It was a weapon that existed in a different category entirely, that made previous calculations of military power obsolete. Some Japanese scientists had understood the theoretical possibility of atomic weapons. There had even been limited efforts within Japan to explore nuclear physics, though these never advanced beyond the most preliminary stages. But understanding something theoretically and confronting its reality are different things. The mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki represented a new age, and that age had arrived with terrifying suddenness. In the post-war period, as Japan rebuilt under American occupation, the lessons of this period were absorbed, internalized, and in some ways transformed into new national narratives. The narrative of victimhood of Japan as the only nation to suffer atomic attack became powerful. And it is true, undeniably true, that the human suffering in Hiroshima and Nagasaki was immense, tragic, beyond any justification that appeals to military necessity can fully provide. But the other lesson, the one about the dangers of self-delusion and strategic planning, about the importance of understanding reality rather than constructing comfortable illusions, remained relevant. Wars are not won by will alone. They are won by understanding the nature of the conflict, by accurately assessing one's own capabilities and those of the enemy, by making decisions based on reality rather than on what one wishes reality to be. The Japanese military command of 1945 discovered this too late. They discovered it in the ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in the ruins of Manchuria, where Soviet tanks rolled over Japanese positions, in the emperor's shaking voice announcing surrender to a stunned nation. They discovered it when there were no more moves to make, no more strategies to attempt, when the gap between their beliefs and reality had widened into an unbridgeable chasm. This is not only a story of military defeat, it is a story of cognitive failure, of the human capacity for self-deception, of the terrible price that nations pay when their leaders cannot distinguish between what they hope is true and what is actually true. It is a story about awakening, but awakening that came too late to prevent catastrophe. In the end, the bombs did not just destroy cities, they shattered illusions. They demonstrated that the modern world operated according to principles that many of Japan's leaders did not fully understand or accept. They showed that industrial capacity and scientific advancement were not merely advantages, but were fundamentally decisive. They proved that faith without foresight is fatal. The Japanese generals and admirals who gathered in the Supreme War Council, who debated the nation's fate in those desperate days of August 1945, were not fools. They were intelligent men, often well-educated, experienced in their fields, but they were also products of their time and their culture, shaped by assumptions and beliefs that turned out to be catastrophically wrong. They believed in things that were not true, and they persisted in those beliefs until reality forced itself upon them in the most brutal way imaginable. This is the lesson that transcends the specific historical moment. Wars, and indeed all human endeavors that require accurate assessment of reality, demand a willingness to see clearly, to accept uncomfortable truths, to adjust beliefs in light of evidence. The alternative is disaster. Japan learned this lesson at terrible cost. The question for any nation or leader facing strategic decisions is whether the lesson can be learned without paying such a price. The moment the Supreme War Council finally accepted reality, finally acknowledged that faith and courage were not enough to overcome the material and scientific superiority of their enemies, was the moment Japan truly entered the modern world. It was an awakening born of ashes and ruin, purchased with hundreds of thousands of lives. But it was an awakening nonetheless. The nation that emerged from the ruins, that rebuilt itself in the decades after surrender, did so with a different understanding of how power operates in the modern age. That understanding, that hard-won knowledge purchased at such terrible cost, remains relevant. The specific circumstances of 1945 will not be repeated. The atomic monopoly the United States briefly enjoyed is long gone. The world has changed in countless ways, but the fundamental principle remains. Reality does not bend to our wishes. Facts do not change because we want them to. And strategic decisions made on the basis of comfortable illusions rather than clear-eyed assessment of actual conditions lead to disaster. The voices of Japan's military leaders in those final days of the war, captured in interrogations and memoirs, in recorded conversations and written statements, echo across the decades. They speak of awakening, of understanding coming too late, of the terrible realization that everything they had believed about the nature of modern conflict was wrong. We never believed America could produce so much. Spirit cannot stop uranium. We have been fighting a nation we never truly understood. These are the voices of men confronting the collapse of their worldview. And while we might judge them harshly for their role in leading Japan into a catastrophic war, for their persistence in fighting long after any reasonable hope of victory had vanished, we should also hear in their words a warning that applies beyond their specific circumstances. The danger of self-deception, of substituting belief for analysis, of refusing to accept uncomfortable realities until those realities force themselves upon us with overwhelming violence, is not limited to any single nation or historical period. Japan's surrender in August 1945 marked the end of the Second World War, but it also marked a transformation in how humanity understood organized violence and strategic power. The atomic age had begun, not gradually or theoretically, but with two blinding flashes of light that vaporized cities and forced a nation to its knees. The old certainties, the old assumptions about how wars were fought and won proved inadequate. A new era had begun, and it had announced itself with nuclear fire. For the men who led Japan through those final days, who made the agonizing decision to surrender, who confronted the collapse of everything they had believed about their nation's place in the world. The experience was transformative. Some, like General Anami, could not survive it. Others lived with the burden of those decisions for decades, revisiting in memoirs and interviews the choices made in August 1945, trying to explain to themselves and to history how it had come to this. But perhaps the most important legacy of that moment is not found in individual stories, however dramatic or tragic, but in the broader lesson it teaches. Wars are not won by will alone. Strategic success requires understanding reality, accepting uncomfortable truths, and making decisions based on clear-eyed assessment rather than comforting illusions. This is not merely a historical observation. It is a principle that remains relevant wherever and whenever humans make decisions about conflict, competition, and the application of power. The morning of August 6, 1945, began with an impossible message. By August 15th, Japan's leaders had been forced to confront the reality behind that impossibility. In between lay a journey from denial to acceptance, from illusion to awakening. It was a journey that cost hundreds of thousands of lives and left a nation in ruins. But it was also a journey that revealed fundamental truths about how the modern world operates, truths that Japan's leaders had refused to accept until reality left them no choice. This then is not only a story of defeat, though it is certainly that. It is a story of awakening, of the moment when a nation finally saw clearly the true nature of the world it inhabited. That vision came too late to prevent catastrophe, too late to save the cities that burned in atomic fire, too late for the millions who died in the war that Japan's leaders prolonged beyond any rational justification. But the vision itself, the clear-eyed understanding of modern power that emerged from the ashes of August 1945 remains. It stands as testament to the cost of delusion and the necessity of confronting reality, however uncomfortable that confrontation might be.